Wyoming Territory, 1879. While every other homesteader on Sweetwater Flats was racing to raise log walls before the first hard freeze, a widow named Ingrid Solberg was 3 feet down in a hole, swinging a pickaxe at frozen subsoil with the steady patience of a woman who had nothing left to prove and nobody left to please. Her neighbors rode by on the wagon road and stared. They called what she was building a grave with a roof on it. They said no decent woman dropped her floor below grade like a root cellar and called the result a home. They warned her that snow melt would drown her family by April, that mice and snakes would own the place by June, and that any cabin sunk into the dirt was a cabin half-finished and wholly disgraceful. She kept digging anyway. She kept hauling out buckets of clay and gravel by the dozen, banking the spoil against 3 sides of her foundation, and laying her sill logs on a stone footing 36 inches below the prairie surface. Her neighbors finished their cabins in 5 weeks. Ingrid spent 11 on hers. She set her ridge pole only 7 feet above her sunken floor when most settlers built ceilings of 9 or 10. She framed 2 small south-facing windows when everyone else cut 3 or 4 large ones for light. By the time the first snow squall scoured the flats in late October, her place looked from a distance like a low brown hump in the grass, with a stovepipe rising out of it, and the men at the Sweetwater General Store had taken to calling it the Prairie Doghouse, with a laugh that wasn't entirely kind. Then January the 1880 arrived with its teeth out, a cold wave pushed down from the Canadian plains, and stalled over central Wyoming for 19 days. Outside, thermometers fell to 34 below zero and stayed there. Wind on the open flats reached 40 miles per hour for stretches that lasted from sundown to sunrise. Inside conventional log cabins along the Sweetwater, families burned cordwood faster than the men could split it, and still woke to find drinking water frozen solid in pails 6 feet from the stove. Ice formed on interior walls. Children slept in 3 layers of wool and still shivered. But inside Ingrid Solberg's mocked sunken cabin, the floor stayed warm enough to cross barefoot at dawn. Her wash basin never iced over. Her stove burned a third the wood her neighbors fed theirs. And when she set her thermometer at the level where her boys slept, the mercury held steady at 56 degrees. On a morning when the cabin half a mile north of hers registered 28. A 28-degree difference between 2 homes built within sight of each other on the same exposed flats. What did this Norwegian widow understand about earth, frost lines, and stable ground temperatures that men who had built cabins for 30 years had never thought to ask? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Drop a comment with your city and the temperature outside your window right now. We love seeing where these stories find their listeners. Ingrid Solberg arrived on Sweetwater Flats in the spring of 1879 with 2 half-grown sons, a cracked Bible, a small chest of tools her husband had hammered together himself, and a bone-deep familiarity with the way cold could kill a person who didn't respect it. She was 42 years old. Her face had the weathered set of someone who had buried a child in Minnesota and a husband in Nebraska, and learned each time that grief did not pause for weather, and that weather did not pause for grief. She had inherited the Wyoming claim from a brother-in-law who had filed on it in 1876, and then walked away when his wife refused to follow him into what she called the empty country. The land was hers now if she could prove it up, and she had 3 years to plant a crop, raise a structure, and convince a federal land agent that she was a permanent fixture rather than a passing one. The Sweetwater country in 1879 was a long sweep of high grassland broken by sage flats and shallow draws, with the Wind River Range gleaming white on the western horizon, and not a tree in sight for the eye to rest on. The wind on those flats blew 9 days out of 10 and rested only when it was gathering strength. There was a creek running in a cottonwood-lined cut 3/4 of a mile from her claim stake, but no surface stone for building, no native timber except scattered cedars in the breaks, and no neighbors close enough to share a wall with, even if she had wanted that. The settlers already established along the road were a thin scatter, no more than a dozen families inside 10 miles, and the closest of them was a man named Hollis Dern, a former Iowa farmer who had been on his quarter section for 2 years and considered himself the local authority on what would and would not work in the territory. Hollis Dern rode over the second day Ingrid was on the claim, sat his sorrel mare on the rise above her wagon, and looked down at the small woman who was already pacing off the perimeter of her future cabin with a length of knotted twine. He was not unfriendly. He was just certain. He told her in the voice of a man explaining the obvious to a child that the country wanted log construction, that she should send back to the rail terminus for milled timber if she could afford it, or settle for cottonwood from the creek if she couldn't, that her walls needed to stand at least 8 feet at the eaves and her ridge no less than 12, and that anything less would not pass for a proved-up dwelling when the land agent came around. He told her that if she didn't have a man to do the cutting and notching, she should hire one out of the rail camp at Rawlins, because no woman alone could raise the kind of cabin a Wyoming winter would forgive. Ingrid thanked him for the advice in the careful English she had been polishing for 16 years and went back to pacing. Hollis sat his horse a while longer, then nudged the sorrel back toward the road, and the next day at the Sweetwater store he told the men at the Cracker Barrel that the new widow on the south claim was going to need a great deal of help before the snow flew, and probably wasn't going to take it when it was offered. But Ingrid Solberg did not need Hollis Dern's kind of help. She needed a particular kind of memory, and that she had in abundance. She had grown up in a valley above the Sognefjord in western Norway, in a settlement where the winters lasted from the last week of October to the second week of April, and the families who survived them had been refining their methods since long before the Vikings sailed for Iceland. The houses she remembered from her girlhood were not the tall, airy log cabins the Americans built. They were squat and earth-banked. They were dug down. They had thick turf roofs that grew grass and wildflowers in summer, and walls of sod and stone that disappeared into the slope behind them. Her grandfather's old Orstu, the central hearth house that had passed through 4 generations of the family, sat with its floor more than 3 feet below the meadow grade, and its north and east walls buried to the eaves. In January, when the wind off the fjord drove the surface temperature to 15 below, the inside of that house held steady around 50 degrees with nothing more than a hearth fire built up at supper and banked overnight. Ingrid had not consciously thought about that house in 20 years. But standing on the Wyoming Flats in April 1879, with the wind shouldering at her shawl and the empty grass running off in every direction to the horizon, she remembered her grandfather's house with a clarity that felt like instruction. There was no timber here. There was no stone. There was no shelter at all from the wind. What there was, and what there was in vast and reliable supply, was earth. 20 feet down, 50 feet down, 2,000 feet down, the earth went on, and at any depth past 3 feet, the temperature of that earth, summer or winter, drought or blizzard, sat between 48 and 54 degrees on the thermometer. She did not know the exact number in 1879. The geologists would publish their soil temperature studies later, but she knew the principle. Anyone who had ever stored potatoes in a Norwegian root cellar knew the principle. The deeper you went, the steadier the cold and the warmer the cold. And a cabin floor sitting on that steady warmth was a cabin standing on top of a slow, patient, bottomless reservoir of heat that no Wyoming winter could drain. She made the decision in the second week of April. She would dig her cabin down. She would set the floor 3 feet below the surrounding grade, build the walls of cottonwood logs from the creek, bank the excavated dirt up against the outside of those walls in a thick, continuous berm, and put a low-pitched roof on the whole thing with a sod cover thick enough to grow grass. The structure would sit half buried in the prairie, with only the south face and the upper 4 feet of the other walls showing above ground level. From a distance, it would look like a low-rise in the land. From inside, it would feel like the house her grandfather had built in 1782, which was the house his great-grandfather had taught him to build, which was the house people in that valley had been building since the time of the first Christian missionaries. She did not explain any of this to Hollis Dern. She did not explain it to the storekeeper, Adler Quinn, when she went in to order nails and window glass. She did not explain it to the freighter who delivered her stove. She had learned long ago that the explaining was always wasted effort. The men of the American frontier did not want to hear about Norwegian valleys and turf-roofed ore stewer. They wanted to give advice, and the advice they had to give was the advice that fit their experience, and their experience was log cabins set on field stone footings, with floors of split puncheon and ceilings high enough for a tall man to swing an axe handle without scraping the rafters. So she let them say what they were going to say, and she went on with her digging. The digging was the hardest physical work she had ever done. The Wyoming subsoil under the first 8 inches of rooty grass was a dense red-brown clay, shot through with gravel and the occasional fist-sized cobble. In May, with the ground still cold from winter, that clay was nearly as hard as sandstone. Her sons, Mikkel, who was 13, and Sten, who was 11, worked beside her with a smaller pick and a shovel, and the 3 of them moved an estimated 18 cubic yards of soil out of a rectangle, measuring 14 feet by 20 over the course of 7 weeks. They piled most of it on the north and west sides of the excavation, where it would later be banked against the walls. They saved the topsoil separately, in a long ridge along the south edge, because Ingrid intended to use it for her sod roof. Hollis Dern rode by twice during the digging and stopped each time to comment. The first time he simply asked if she was building a cellar before her cabin, which seemed to him an odd order of operations. Ingrid said the cellar and the cabin were going to be the same thing. Hollis chewed on that for a moment and then suggested that she might want to reconsider, because a cellar needed proper drainage and a cabin needed proper light, and the 2 purposes were generally agreed to require different structures. Ingrid said she had thought about both and was satisfied with her plan. Hollis rode on. The second time he came by, in early June, the excavation was nearly to its final depth, and Ingrid was laying the foundation course, a single ring of Flat Creek stones she had hauled in her wagon. 2 stones thick and bedded in clay mortar she mixed in a wooden trough. Hollis swung down off his horse, walked to the edge of the pit, and looked into it for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at Ingrid, the way a man looks at someone he has decided is no longer entirely sound. "Mrs. Solberg," he said, "I have built or helped build 17 cabins in this country since I came out in 76. Not one of them has had its floor below the level of the surrounding ground. Not one. There is a reason for that. Water comes in, mice come in, snakes come in, damp comes in and never leaves. You will not be warm in there. You will be cold and wet, and your boys will get the lung sickness. I am telling you this as a Christian neighbor." Ingrid set the stone she had been holding into its bed of clay, tapped it level with the wooden mallet her husband had carved, and then straightened and looked at Hollis with the gray, level, slightly tired gaze that had unsettled rougher men than him. "Mr. Dern," she said, "I thank you for the concern. The water will not come in because the ground is sloped, and I have planned the drainage. The mice will come in regardless of where my floor sits. The damp I can manage, and the warmth you can come and judge for yourself in February." Then she bent down for the next stone, and Hollis stood there a moment with his thumbs in his belt, and finally got back on his horse and rode away. He did not stop again until October. Through the rest of June and into July, Ingrid and her sons completed the foundation. The creek stones rose 3 courses high around the perimeter, bringing the top of the foundation to within 6 inches of the original ground level. On top of those stones, she laid her sill logs, 4 heavy cottonwood timbers that the boys and she had cut, dragged out of the creek bottom with the ox, and squared on 2 sides with an adze. The sills were notched and pinned at the corners with hand-shaped wooden pegs, since Ingrid was conserving her supply of square nails for the roof framing. By the 2nd week of July, the sills were down, and the floor of the future cabin was 3 feet below the prairie surface, with the foundation stones ringing it like the rim of a long, shallow well. The wall logs went up through the heat of late July and August. Ingrid had decided on a wall height of 7 feet from the sunken floor, which meant the logs only needed to rise 4 feet above the original grade. This was the part of the design that drew the loudest mockery from passing settlers. Cabins on the Wyoming Flats stood 8 or 9 feet at the eaves as a matter of regional pride. A cabin that barely cleared a man's head from the outside looked unfinished, looked stunted, looked like the work of someone who had given up halfway through. Adler Quinn, the storekeeper, came out one Sunday afternoon to see what the talk was about, and stood by his buggy looking at the half-built structure with frank confusion. He told Ingrid that her walls looked like they belonged on a smokehouse, not a dwelling. Ingrid nodded politely and went on chinking with a mixture of clay, cut grass, and a small amount of hair from the ox. What Adler Quinn could not see, and what Ingrid did not bother explaining, was that the low wall height was not a flaw, but a feature. Every cubic foot of interior space was a cubic foot of air that had to be heated. A cabin with a 9-foot ceiling held nearly 30% more air than one with a 7-foot ceiling of the same floor area. That extra air rose to the rafters and sat there, useless, while the people below it burned wood to replace the heat that had floated away from them. Ingrid's grandfather had built his ore stew with a ceiling so low a tall man had to stoop near the walls, and the family had been warm because of it, not in spite of it. She was making the same trade. She was giving up the airy spaciousness the Americans valued, and getting in return a heated volume small enough that a single small stove could keep the whole interior at 55 degrees on a night when the wind outside was driving the chill to 40 below. The earth banking went up in September. This was the step that finally crossed the line from peculiar into, in the local view, indecent. Ingrid took the long ridge of subsoil she had piled on the north and west sides of the excavation back in May and June, and over the course of 3 weeks she and the boys shoveled it up against the outside of the cabin walls until the dirt reached within 18 inches of the eaves. On the east wall she banked it to the same level. On the south wall, where the door and the 2 small windows were set, she left the original grade alone and even sloped the ground away from the foundation for drainage. From the north, when she was done, the cabin looked like nothing so much as a long, low burial mound with a stovepipe sticking out of one end. From the south, it looked like a small log cabin half sunk into a meadow. The sod roof went on in early October. Ingrid had cut sod from a lush flat near the creek through the latter half of September, laying the squares face down on the wagon and hauling them in load by load. The roof structure underneath was a low pitch of rough-hewn rafters covered with split cottonwood planking, and over that planking she laid 2 layers of overlapping birch bark. She had paid a Shoshone trader $6 and a side of bacon to bring her from the Wind River foothills, and over the birch bark she laid the sod, grass side up, in courses 6 inches thick. By the time the first sticking snow fell on October 22nd, the roof was finished, the chinking was tight, the small iron stove was vented and burning, and Ingrid Solberg's mocked half-buried cabin was complete. It had cost her 11 weeks of labor and most of her cash reserves. It had earned her the steady disapproval of every neighbor inside 10 miles. Hollis Dern, who finally rode by again in late October to see how the foolishness had turned out, swung down and walked all the way around the structure with his hands in his coat pockets and his mouth set in a hard line. Then he stood at the south door, which Ingrid had just hung on its leather hinges, and shook his head. "You have built yourself a hole in the ground, Mrs. Solberg," he said more sadly than cruelly, "and come February you are going to wish you had not." Ingrid invited him to come back in February and check. The winter of 1879 to 1880 began mild. November was kind. The first 3 weeks of December were unseasonably warm, with afternoon temperatures in the high 30s and only one significant snowfall. The settlers along the Sweetwater took the early gentleness as a sign and let their wood piles thin and their guard down. The men sat at the Cracker Barrel in Adler Quinn's store and told each other that the country was finally turning. The widow with the underground cabin became a topic only in passing, mentioned mostly in the context of how strange a winter this was going to be for everyone, including her. The cold wave hit on the night of January 4th, 1880, and it hit hard. A high-pressure system from the Yukon had been building and sliding south through Alberta for 3 days, and when it finally crossed into Wyoming, it brought with it a mass of Arctic air so cold and so dry that it changed the sound of the prairie. People who lived through that 19-day stretch later remembered that the air felt brittle, that wood snapped when you split it instead of cracking, that animals breathing nearby produced a steady shimmer of ice crystals you could see in lamplight. The temperature on the morning of January 5th, taken from the thermometer mounted on the north wall of Adler Quinn's store, read 26 below zero. By the morning of the 7th, it was 31 below. By the morning of the 9th, it was 34 below, and there it more or less stayed, with daily highs that crawled to 20 below at midday, and nightly lows that bottomed at 36 below, until the wave finally broke on January 23rd. On the second night of the cold wave, January 5th, Hollis Stern's cabin was holding interior temperatures of barely 38 degrees 3 feet from a stove he had been feeding continuously for 18 hours. The chinking between his logs, which had seemed adequate in November, had dried and contracted in the brutal cold, and was now letting in fine wires of frigid air through gaps a man could see by holding a candle along the wall. Hollis was burning seasoned cottonwood and pine at a rate of nearly half a cord every 24 hours. His wife, Bess, had layered all 4 of their wool blankets onto the children's shared bed and was still finding ice crystals in their hair when she checked them at midnight. The water in the kitchen pail had a 1/4 inch of ice across the top by morning, despite sitting 4 feet from the stove. A mile and a half east, the McLean family was in worse shape. Their cabin was newer, the chinking less seasoned, and their wood supply already running down because the man of the house, a young homesteader named Cyrus McLean, had badly underestimated his needs and now could not get out into the weather long enough to cut more. The McLean's 5-year-old daughter developed a deep, wet cough on the night of the 6th, and by the morning of the 8th, her mother was holding her wrapped in a quilt within 2 feet of the stove, and weeping quietly, because the child's lips had taken on a faint blue tinge that no amount of fire seemed to correct. A half-mile west, the Vesper Place, run by a German-Russian family who had come up from the Volga settlements 4 years earlier, was managing somewhat better because they had built thicker walls and stocked more wood. But even Conrad Vesper, who knew cold the way a fisherman knows water, was finding his interior pre-dawn temperatures dropping into the low 30s, despite a stove he kept hot enough to glow at the seams. And a half-mile south of all of them, on the rise where Ingrid Solberg had dug her cabin 3 feet into the prairie, the Solberg family was waking on the morning of January 5th to an interior temperature measured by Ingrid's small wooden-case thermometer placed at floor level beside the boys' bunks, of 54 degrees. Her stove had burned out 2 hours before dawn. The wood she had fed it the night before amounted to 4 split sticks of cottonwood, none thicker than her wrist. The wash basin on the table near the door held water that was cold but unfrozen. Her son Sten, who was the lighter sleeper, sat up in his blankets, pulled on his trousers and his wool shirt without any of the bracing his cousins would have done in a normal Wyoming cabin, and crossed the puncheon floor to the stove in his bare feet, because the floor was not cold enough to bother him. Ingrid lit the stove with a single match, fed it 3 more small sticks of cottonwood, and put the coffee pot on. By the time the coffee boiled, the cabin had risen from 54 degrees to 61. The heat was not pouring from the stove. The stove was small and the fire in it was modest. The heat was coming from everywhere at once. It was coming from the floor, which sat on a layer of compacted clay and sand that had been in contact with the deeper subsoil all winter and was holding a steady 48 degrees of its own. It was coming from the lower halves of the walls, which were buried under 3 feet of banked earth on 3 sides, and were therefore not radiating heat outward into 34 below air, but were instead exchanging heat with the deeper soil, at temperatures only a few degrees below the cabin's interior. It was coming from the sod roof, which presented 6 inches of frozen turf and another 4 inches of insulating air pockets between the family and the killing wind. What was happening inside Ingrid's cabin that morning was a thermal arrangement that would not be properly described in print until the Agricultural Research Station bulletins of the late 1930s, and would not be popularly understood until the earth-sheltered building movement of the 1970s, but had been worked out by trial and error in northern climates for at least 3,000 years. The principle was straightforward. The earth, beginning at the depth where the frost ceased to penetrate, held a temperature very close to the average annual air temperature of the region. In central Wyoming, that average was roughly 45 to 50 degrees. A cabin floor in contact with that earth, and walls partially buried in it, did not have to be heated against a 40 below outside temperature. It only had to be heated against the soil temperature, which sat almost 100 degrees warmer than the screaming January air. The wind that was draining heat from Hollister's exposed log walls at a punishing rate was not draining heat from Ingrid's banked walls at all, because the wind never touched those walls. The earth touched them, and the earth was warm. Ingrid did not know the term thermal lag in 1880, but she knew from her grandfather and from her own girlhood memory that a half-buried house was warm in winter and cool in summer because the earth around it changed temperature slowly, and the change it underwent in any given week was always lagging weeks behind the change in the open air. She knew that the surface temperature of the prairie in early January would not penetrate to her sill logs until late February, and by then it would have been blunted by passage through 3 feet of soil to the point where her cabin walls might exchange a few degrees with the cold, but never the full brunt of it. She knew, in the practical bone knowledge of a Norwegian farm wife, that you did not fight the winter, you hid from it, and the place to hide was inside the earth. Her sons, Mikkel and Sten, did not yet understand the thermodynamics. What they understood on that 5th morning of January, when the wind outside was bending the dry grass flat and the sound of it through the chimney was a low, continuous moan, was that they were warm, and the ridicule their mother had absorbed for 11 weeks the previous summer had paid out something they had not quite believed in until that moment. Sten put on his boots, took the wooden bucket from beside the door, and went out to fetch fresh snow to melt for the day's water. The blast of cold air that came through the open door dropped the cabin's interior temperature by perhaps 2 degrees, enough that Ingrid noticed it, but not enough that she remarked on it. Sten was back inside in under a minute. The door closed. The cabin warmed up again. Outside, on the surface of the prairie, the wind was hauling away the last fragile reserves of warmth from every conventional cabin within 50 miles. Inside Ingrid's, the family ate breakfast in shirt sleeves. It was on the morning of the 9th that Hollis Dern finally rode over to check on the widow, partly because he had promised her in October that he would come, and partly because he had begun to realize, with a slow and uncomfortable certainty, that the situation in his own cabin was sliding from difficult into dangerous. His wood pile was down to less than a third of what he had laid in. His chinking was failing in places he could not reach without major repairs the cold made impossible. His youngest, a 4-year-old boy named Asa, had developed the same wet cough that was passing through the McLean household, and Bess Dern had begun to look at her husband across the stove with a quiet, fixed expression that said louder than any words that he was going to need to find a solution before the situation found one for them. The ride from Hollis's claim to Ingrid's was less than 3/4 of a mile, but it took him 40 minutes in the conditions of January 9th, 1880. The wind, blowing steady at 30 miles per hour out of the northwest, had pushed the effective temperature against any exposed skin to somewhere near 60 below. Hollis had wrapped his face in a wool muffler and pulled his fur cap down to his eyebrows and was still finding his eyelashes freezing together every few hundred yards. The sorrel mare he was riding was a tough animal, but even she was laboring against the wind, her breath crystallizing on her muzzle in long white feathers. When Hollis came up over the rise that hid the south face of Ingrid's claim from the road, what he saw stopped him for a moment in the saddle. The Solberg cabin, half buried as it was, looked from this angle in the white wind almost like a long drift of snow with a stovepipe rising out of it. A single thin thread of wood smoke came from that stovepipe, running flat and thin for 10 feet downwind before the wind tore it apart. Hollis stared at that smoke. From his own chimney, a 1/4 mile west, a thick gray-black plume was pouring constantly, the smoke of a stove being fed at maximum draw to maintain barely livable conditions. From Ingrid's chimney, the smoke was the smoke of a small fire in a small space that did not need much, because not much was being lost. He swung down at the south door, which was set into a small recessed entry Ingrid had framed to act as a cold trap, knocked twice, and waited. The inner door opened. Ingrid stood in the doorway in a wool dress, no shawl, no jacket, her sleeves pushed up past her forearms because she had been kneading bread when he knocked. Behind her, the cabin's interior was warm enough that Hollis felt the heat against his frozen face like the heat from an open oven. He stood there in the cold trap with snow blowing around his boots and stared past her at his neighbor's living room, and for a long moment he could not find a thing to say. "Mr. Dern," Ingrid said finally, "come in before I lose all my warm air." Hollis came in. He sat down at the small plank table near the south windows, where the morning sun, weak as it was nevertheless coming through the glass and laying a band of pale yellow across the puncheon floor. He pulled off his muffler. He pulled off his cap. He looked around. The cabin was small, low-ceilinged, and dim, and it was warm. Not warm in the brittle, layered, fight against the cold way Hollis's own cabin was warm 3 feet from the stove. It was warm in a quiet, even, pervasive way that made him realize, after sitting for 2 minutes, that his coat was uncomfortable, and he ought to take it off. He took it off. The boys, Mikkel and Sten, were at the back of the cabin, mending a bridle and reading from a McGuffey's Reader respectively, and they nodded at him politely. The stove, a small cast-iron box no larger than a bread chest, had 2 sticks of cottonwood in it, neither of them on fire. The coals were enough. Hollis looked at that stove and looked at the thermometer Ingrid had hung on the inside of her north wall, and the thermometer read 62 degrees. Outside, his sorrel mare was tied to a post by the door, and outside that door the wind was driving 34 below air across a continent of grass. "It's Mrs. Solberg," Hollis said carefully. "What have you done in here?" Ingrid set a tin cup of hot coffee in front of him. She sat down across the table. She told him in plain language and without any pleasure that he could detect in the telling what she had done. She told him about the 3-foot excavation. She told him about the banked earth on 3 sides. She told him about the sod roof and the low ceiling and the small windows and the cold trap entry. She told him that the floor of the cabin was sitting on the same earth that 3 feet down did not freeze in winter and did not warm in summer, and that the earth was therefore a kind of slow, steady stove that ran on nothing and never went out. She told him about her grandfather's ore stew and the centuries of Norwegian farmers who had built into the slope behind their meadows for reasons that were not aesthetic and not poor and not primitive, but simply correct. Hollis Dern listened. He drank the coffee. He drank a second cup. He went outside for a moment to check on the mare and felt the full weight of the wind against his face, and then he came back in and felt the cabin's silent warmth wrap around him again, and he sat down a second time, and at length he said, "Mrs. Solberg, I have a 4-year-old boy at home with a cough and a woodpile that is going to run out in a week." "Bring them," Ingrid said, "all of you." The Derns moved into the Solberg cabin on the afternoon of January 9th. They came in 2 trips with the mare and a small sled, and they brought blankets. The youngest 2 children bundled into laundry baskets, a sack of cornmeal, and the cookpot. By that evening there were 7 people in the 14 by 20 cabin, 4 adults and 3 children, and Ingrid had set a quilt across one corner to give the Derns a small private space, and her boys had given up their bunk to the Dern children and were sleeping on pallets in front of the stove. The cabin was tighter than it had ever been. It was also with 7 people generating body heat in a space that was already retaining warmth like a buried oven, warmer than it had been. Ingrid actually had to crack the cold trap door slightly to vent excess humidity from all the breathing. The McLean family came the next day, the 10th. Cyrus McLean rode in on his mule, with the 4-year-old daughter wrapped against his chest inside his coat. He had heard from Hollis, who had ridden over to the McLean place that morning to share the news. Cyrus did not ask whether there was room. He did not have the energy or the dignity left to ask. He simply said his daughter was getting worse, his wood was nearly gone, and his wife was ready to walk. Ingrid took the child from him at the door and put her down in the warm corner near the stove, and within half an hour the bluish color was gone from the girl's lips, and she had fallen into the first untroubled sleep she had managed in 4 days. The McLean parents and their other child arrived by sled before sundown. There were now 11 people in the cabin. The Vespers came on the 11th. Conrad Vesper, who had built one of the better insulated structures on the flats, and was not a man easily defeated by weather, had nevertheless watched his interior temperature crash to 28 degrees on the morning of the 11th, and had decided, with the practicality of a man who knew when to revise his plans, that whatever the widow Solberg was doing, it was clearly working, and there was no shame in walking 3/4 of a mile to find out. He brought his wife, Marta, his 3 children, and a substantial sack of food, including a side of cured pork and a wheel of hard cheese that immediately quadrupled the value of Ingrid's larder. There were now 16 people in the cabin. The cabin was 14 by 20. That gave it 280 square feet of floor space. 16 people in a normal frontier home would have been unworkable. In Ingrid's earth-banked, low-ceilinged, body heat amplifying cabin, it was tight, but it was warm, and warm was the only thing that mattered. The adults arranged themselves in shifts so that there was always someone awake to tend the stove and the children. The children slept where they fell. The cookpot was on continuously. There was a kind of strange, warm, candlelit, communal quality to those days, a pulling in of the whole exposed neighborhood into a single pocket of survivable space that the people who lived through it would talk about for the rest of their lives. On the morning of the 14th, 10 days into the cold wave, with the outside temperature at 35 below and the wind still steady, Conrad Vesper, who had brought a small German-made thermometer in his coat pocket, conducted what he later called the experiment. He carried the thermometer outside to the road, held it at arm's length for 10 minutes, and read it. Minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit. He carried it back inside and hung it on a peg 3 feet above the puncheon floor in the center of the cabin. He waited 15 minutes. He read it. Positive 61 degrees Fahrenheit. The differential between inside and outside was 95 degrees. The differential between Ingrid's cabin and Hollis Stern's abandoned cabin, which had cooled to 33 degrees with the fire out, was 28 degrees. Conrad wrote both numbers down in a small notebook he kept in his vest pocket. He had been a student at a technical school in Saratov before he emigrated, and the habit of measurement had stayed with him. He showed the numbers to Hollis. He showed them to Cyrus McLean. He showed them to Ingrid, who looked at them and nodded once, the way a person nods at a mathematical proof of something they already know to be true. 28 degrees warmer, Mrs. Solberg, Conrad said quietly, in his accented English, with the same wood, with the same wind, with the same sky. 28 degrees because of the dirt, because you put the floor in the dirt. Ingrid took the notebook from him, read the numbers a second time, and gave it back. Then she went and stirred the pot of stew that was feeding the 16 of them, and did not say anything else about it. There was no need. Outside, the wind was howling. Inside, the floor was warm and the children were sleeping. The accounting had already been done. The cold wave broke on the morning of January 23rd. The wind shifted into the south overnight, and within 12 hours the temperature on the prairie rose from 33 below to 9 above. The change was so abrupt that several of the men, including Hollis Stern, walked outside in their shirt sleeves to feel it, simply to confirm that something so improbable was actually happening. Within 3 days, the daytime highs were back into the 20s, and the families that had taken refuge with Ingrid began the careful process of returning to their own homesteads, repairing their chinking, replenishing what was left of their wood supplies, and reckoning with what the previous 19 days had taught them. What it had taught them was not, in the end, complicated. It was that there were 2 ways to handle a Wyoming winter. The first way was to build a cabin on top of the prairie, expose it on all 4 sides to the wind, line its interior walls with whatever insulation a person could afford, and then burn wood as fast as possible to maintain a temperature differential against an outside that was always trying to drag the inside down to 0. This was the way every cabin within 10 miles had been built, and during the cold wave of January 1880, it had nearly killed several families and had put every one of them into a state of constant labor and constant fear. The second way was to put the cabin partly into the earth, let the soil itself take on most of the work of moderating the temperature, and use a small amount of wood to do the rest. This was Ingrid's way. It was an old way, older than any of the men on the Sweetwater Flats had realized, and the cold wave had proved, in the most direct empirical fashion possible, that it worked. The proof did not announce itself in any single dramatic moment after the families went home. Instead, it surfaced slowly, in conversation, in plans, in the small adjustments people began making to their existing cabins as the rest of the winter played out. Hollis Stern, who was not a man given to public reversals, did not stand up at the Sweetwater store and announce that he had been wrong about the widow. What he did instead, in the second week of February, was ride over to Ingrid's place with a notebook of his own and asked her to walk him through the construction details one more time, this time with measurements. Ingrid did. Hollis took notes for 2 hours. He measured the bank height on the north wall. He measured the foundation depth. He asked about drainage, about the cold trap entry, about the sod roof and the birch bark layer, and the chinking mixture. He asked how a man might modify an existing above-ground cabin to gain some of the same advantages without rebuilding it from the foundation up. Ingrid considered the question and gave him an answer that was, for her, almost lengthy. She told him that a banked earth wall pushed against the north and west sides of an existing cabin, brought up as high as the eaves and packed firm, would do most of the work of buried walls without requiring excavation. She told him that lowering the ceiling, even by adding a false ceiling of planks below the rafters, would reduce the heated volume and make any stove work better. She told him that the south windows were important because they let in winter sun, which was a free heat source no one in Wyoming was taking advantage of, and that the north and east windows could be reduced to small ports without serious loss of light. She told him that a good cold trap entry at the door was worth more than 2 cords of wood. She told him, finally, that none of these were her ideas. They were her grandfather's, and his grandfather's, and the ideas of the people who had lived through ice ages on the edge of the Norwegian Sea. Hollis Dern took all of this down. In May, when the ground was workable, he set his sons to digging and banking the north and west sides of his cabin, and by October of 1880 his place looked from those directions like a low brown rise with a roof on top, and his wood consumption that following winter dropped by 40%. The McLeans, who had nearly lost their daughter, did not modify their cabin. They abandoned it. In the spring of 1880, Cyrus McLean bought a half-acre of bottomland near the creek, dug a foundation 3 feet deep into the slope of the cut bank, and built a new cabin on Ingrid's pattern, complete with a turf roof and a banked north wall. He did not consult Ingrid directly because he was still embarrassed about needing rescue from a widow he had ignored, but he had spent enough time inside her cabin during the cold wave to remember what he was building. His new place was finished by the 1st of November, and his family wintered in it in 1880 to 1881, and Cyrus's wife Theda told Bess Dern at a quilting frolic the following March that she had not once during that entire second winter felt the kind of cold that had made her wonder, the previous January, whether her child was going to live to morning. Conrad Vesper, who had the technical training to articulate what the others could only feel, became something close to an evangelist for the method. He wrote a long, careful letter to a German-language farming journal in St. Louis in the spring of 1880, describing what he called Erdhausbauweise, the earth house method, and giving credit to Ingrid Solberg by name as the originator, in his community, of the technique. The letter was published. It generated correspondence from settlers across the upper plains and as far east as Iowa, and over the next decade, the basic ideas in it, a partly buried floor, banked walls, a low ceiling, a cold trap entry, found their way into the construction of hundreds of homes in regions where wood was scarce and winter was long. None of the people who eventually built such homes knew Ingrid Solberg's name. Most of them never saw her cabin. The knowledge spread the way useful knowledge usually spreads on a frontier, by word of mouth, by neighbor watching neighbor, by the quiet decision of one family to copy what had clearly worked for another. Ingrid herself, the widow at the center of all this, lived in her sunken cabin on Sweetwater Flats for 21 more years. She proved up the claim in 1882. She raised her 2 sons to manhood there. Mickle went to a small college in Laramie in 1888 and became a school teacher. Steen stayed on the homestead, and in 1894 married a woman from a neighboring claim and built a second sunken cabin a quarter-mile away, deeper and larger than his mother's, which his own children would inherit. Ingrid added a small frame addition to her cabin in 1891, but the original earth-banked, half-buried core remained the heart of the structure, and she lived in it until her death in the spring of 1901. The cabin was still standing in 1947, when a state historical survey team passed through the area documenting early homestead architecture, and the surveyors noted in their report that the structure was unusually well preserved, an unusually warm feeling for an unheated building in October. They did not seem to grasp why. The technical principles Ingrid had borrowed from her grandfather and applied to a Wyoming hillside in 1879 would not be formally rediscovered and renamed by American architects until the 1970s, when the energy crisis prompted a wave of interest in what came to be called earth-sheltered design. By that time, university researchers had measured what Ingrid had simply known. Below the frost line, in most of the continental United States, soil temperature stays between 45 and 58 degrees year-round. A structure in contact with that soil only has to be heated against that mild gradient, not against the punishing extremes of surface air. Earth banked against a wall to a depth of 3 feet eliminates virtually all wind infiltration on that wall. A reduction of ceiling height from 9 feet to 7 feet drops the heated air volume by more than 20%. South-facing windows in a partly buried structure act as passive solar collectors, with the thermal mass of the floor and walls absorbing heat during the day and releasing it through the night. Each of these principles had been worked out by Ingrid Solberg in 1879 from memory and necessity, without instruments, without books, without consultation, and the cold wave of January 1880 had served as the experimental verification of every one of them. What is harder to measure, and what does not show up in any architectural survey, is the second kind of legacy Ingrid left. It was the legacy of a particular kind of attention. The settlers of Sweetwater Flats had arrived on those grasslands with strong assumptions about what a home looked like and how a home worked. And those assumptions were almost entirely visual. A home was tall. A home had a pitched roof and standing eaves and a respectable height-to-width ratio. A home looked like a home. The functional properties of the home, the way it actually behaved against weather, were treated as secondary, as something the heating system would handle. Ingrid's cabin reversed that priority. It looked strange. It looked, to the men who first saw it, ugly. But it functioned with a quiet perfection that no one had matched before, because Ingrid had asked a different question. She had not asked what a home was supposed to look like. She had asked what a home was supposed to do. And the answer to that question, in central Wyoming in the depth of January, was that a home was supposed to keep its people alive. And the most reliable way to do that was to put the home into the earth, where the earth would do most of the keeping. That reframing, the shift from form to function, from appearance to performance, was perhaps the most valuable thing that quietly traveled from cabin to cabin along the Sweetwater after the cold wave broke. The people who later modified their homes or built new ones on Ingrid's pattern were not just copying a technique. They were absorbing a way of thinking. They were learning to ask whether the conventions they had inherited served them, or whether the conventions had simply been shipped west along with the wagon trains and accepted without examination because everyone else accepted them. In the harsh accounting of a Wyoming winter, that kind of re-examination was worth more than any single building method. It was the underlying habit of mind from which all the practical methods grew. Hollis Dern, in his old age, was once asked by a young newspaperman from Cheyenne whether he could name the most important lesson he had learned in his 50 years on the high plains. Hollis was 83 by then. He thought about the question for a long moment, and then he said that the most important lesson he had ever learned had been taught to him by a Norwegian widow with 2 boys and a pickaxe in the winter of 1879 and 1880. And the lesson had been that the men who knew the most were sometimes the men who knew the least, and that you should never mistake the loudness of an opinion for the soundness of it. The newspaperman wrote that down, and it appeared in the Cheyenne paper in the autumn of 1923, 3 years before Hollis Dern's own death. Ingrid Solberg never saw that article. She had been dead for 22 years by the time it was printed, but the cabin she built was still standing, and the floor of it was still 3 feet below the prairie grade, and the earth around it was still doing the slow, patient work it had been doing since the morning the first sill log went down on the foundation stones. On a January night in 1923, with the wind blowing across the same flats it had blown across in 1880, that floor would still have measured around 48 degrees, and a single small fire in a small stove would still have brought the interior to comfortable warmth in under 20 minutes, and any traveler taking shelter in it would still have found, quietly, mysteriously, against all the appearance of the small dark mound from outside, that the inside of Ingrid Solberg's cabin was a place where the cold did not finally get its way. The principles she had lived by were not new, and they were not hers alone. They had been passed to her by her grandfather, who had received them from his, in a long chain of memories stretching back through the silent generations, of people who had survived hard winters in cold places by paying close attention to what actually worked. What was hers, what was particular to her, was the courage and the steadiness to bring that knowledge across an ocean, set it down in a country that had no use for it, take 11 weeks of mockery for it, and trust that the eventual judge of the matter would not be her neighbors but the weather itself. The weather came in January 1880, and the weather rendered its verdict, and the verdict was 28 degrees of warmth that no one else on the Sweetwater could match. That was Ingrid Solberg's quiet vindication, not a lecture, not an apology demanded, not even particularly a moment of public satisfaction, just a small, low cabin on a high prairie, with 16 people sheltering inside it through the worst week of the worst winter in living memory, and a cook-pot full of stew on the stove, and the children sleeping warm. That was all the proof she had ever needed to offer, and it was all the proof, in the end, that the country had ever needed to receive. If this story moved you, or if it reminded you of something a grandparent or great-grandparent once told you about how their people kept warm in the old country, share it with someone who would appreciate it. Tap the like button so the platform knows to bring stories like this to other people. Subscribe to the channel for more documented accounts of practical wisdom that quietly outlasted the loud opinions of its time. And in the comments, tell us about a piece of old, slow, patient knowledge that someone in your family carried. The kind of knowledge that the world dismissed for years and then, sooner or later, came around to. We read every comment. We always do.